Okay, so first of all, welcome to Technical Session 1C. Technical Session 1C addresses the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction 2015-2030 in view of Sustainable Development Goals. I would like first to congratulate the organizers of the conference, the Scientific and Organizing Committee, for the work done, and I welcome you all following this session. In particular, also welcoming the six researchers, the six group of researchers, the six presenters who will be with us this morning during the session. I would also like to introduce Ms. Sanoya Seneviratne, who is the co-chair of this session and who will be also making comments and presenting very soon after my brief introduction. So once again, welcome. I would like to say just a few words about the implementation of the Sendai Framework in order to be able to achieve Sustainable Development Goals, mostly intended as a background. And for this overview, I'm referring to the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, a document they have presented which addresses Sustainable Development Goals in view of the Sendai Framework. And in this document, they look at an important principle that sustainable development cannot be attained while disasters continue to affect, to undermine economic growth and social progress. Indeed, all countries or sectors are not immune to the impacts which natural hazards, which are increasing in frequency and intensity due to climate change, we must say, and therefore countries and different sectors have to be well prepared for these impacts. Quoting from this document, in fact, it is stated that while critical, simply preparing for disaster is definitely not enough. And we need to realize they present the transformative potential of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. And this is done by governments and stakeholders who have affirmed that disaster risk reduction needs to be at the core of sustainable development, that they need to commit to this important action. The Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction 2015-2030 must be considered as a first agreement of the post-2015 development agenda. And it includes, as we know, 7 global targets, which are accompanied by a comprehensive set of guiding principles, which give direction to reduce the impact of disasters, whilst, we must say, address also different drivers for disaster risk, which need to be taken into account, but also intended to safeguard current and future development gains. This is well stated in this document. In concluding this introduction, one must also note that the progress in implementing the Sendai Framework is directed towards achieving and meeting the Sustainable Development Goals. So there is this intimate relationship, and one must also note that progress on sustainable development goals can indeed build the needed resilience of people, of populations, of governments, when faced with disasters which continue to occur, and I must say occur with increasing frequency and intensity. So there are a number of targets across the 17 Sustainable Development Goals that are indeed directly related and intimately related, I must say, to disaster risk reduction. And on the other hand, all 7 global targets of the Sendai Framework are critical for the achievement, as stated in the UN ISDR report. The 7 global targets of the Sendai Framework are critical for the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. In this context, therefore, we have indeed 6 very relevant and important presentations by leading experts in the field. I must say, very interesting abstracts, which my colleague will be presenting shortly. So I would like now to invite my co-chair for the session, Ms. Anoya Seneviratne, to make her introduction. Anoya Seneviratne. I'm checking that she is online.
I think
Anoya?
she hasn't joined us yet, sir.
Oh, okay. So she's not yet with us, in which case I will move on to give a quick introduction to the papers in her stead. So basically, we have 6 key papers which reflect these important links between disaster resilience and sustainable development goals, as I just mentioned. So we have 6 presentations. The first one is about a site-specific study on peacock and human conflict, which refers to a case study from Sri Lanka. This is followed by an interesting presentation on sustainable development goals and disaster risk reduction, dealing with targets and challenges for India. The third presentation refers to, it is entitled Introducing New Initiatives for Resettlement in Sri Lanka, and focuses on an analysis of a region in Sri Lanka. The fourth presentation refers to the built environment discipline's roles in disaster risk reduction by Huddersfield University, followed by a presentation which refers to assessing the effectiveness of the relief allocation for drought-affected areas. And in this case, it's a case study, once again, from a specific district. And finally, last but not least, the final presentation for this session is strategy followed for the establishment of local disaster risk reduction plans in Sri Lanka as well. So having given that introduction, now I would like to invite the first presenter. We have the presentation entitled A Site-Specific Study on Peacock and Human Conflict, a case study from a region in Sri Lanka by Herat Kwantilake and Chandrasekhara. Before our colleagues start the presentation, I would like to remind you that you can use the chat if you have questions, which we can address at the end of the session. And I do ask you to contribute with your questions, which we will do our best to address. So I also encourage the presenters to address any chat questions which arise. So I kindly ask you to refer to the questions you put in the chat to specific presenters. And I would also like to remind all the presenters to please keep to the allotted time for the presentation. Thank you very much. So once again, I invite research group Herat Guanatilake and Chandrasekhara to make the presentation. I make a premise. I apologize if for some reason I misspell your names. In that case, I apologize. I would like to welcome the first presenter. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Vatsala Gunatilaka from Department of Geography, University of Colombo. I'm going to present one of my research studies on a site-specific study on peacock and human conflict as a case study from Jantipura Ramniladari Division, Polonnaru district in Sri Lanka. This is the content of my presentation. Let's have an intro. So peacocks are large, colorful pheasants, typically blue and green in color, and they are known for their beautiful tails. and this shows their class, order, family, subfamily, and the genus. And formerly known as the common peafowl, the Indian peafowl was renamed to reflect its content of origin. And normally, the peacocks are identified as flocks of about 5 to 6 members. And also, they are identified as one of the most sensitive group of birds who are very much keen on a very tiny soft noise in their surrounding. And they tend to live in locations that offer access to low trees and plants where grains become their food item. So when talking about the importance of this study, this map clearly suggests that there is a considerable proportionate contribution of wild animals on crop foraging in Sri Lanka. So among all the animals who are damaging the crops of Sri Lankans, the peacock ranks in the highest position. So that impact of wildlife on agriculture is supposed to be around 64% in 2017. And also this problem was limited only to dry zone of Sri Lanka in early periods of time, and now it has invaded the entire island. So this kind of a study is an urgent necessity because their rate of reproduction is very high, and also the delays in taking short-term or long-term decisions would make this an ecological pest as well. So the peafowl is already identified as one of the top agro-pests in Sri Lanka, but it has become a divine pest as well because some people treat peacocks as gods and goddess. So talking about of this study, the main objective is to update the land use and to update the locations of peafowl habitats in the study area, and to identify the behavior of peacock population in the study area, and to assess the causes and impacts on people by peacock population. This is the study area where the Jayantipura Gram Niladhari division, which is located in Hinguragoda DSD, and it belongs to Polonnaruwa district, and the study area mainly belongs to the dry zone of Sri Lanka, and it belongs to the intermediate. So in the methodology, we have mainly used primary data as well as secondary data. So in primary data collection, we have used direct observations and questionnaire survey. So we have mainly located 5 sample points, including a home garden, some wooden land near the home garden, a school land, public playground, and a small paddy field closer to the home garden. So observations were carried out in 3 consecutive days per week, and we have done this study for 2 months period during the northeast monsoon, and observations were done between 15 to 19 hours as we identified productive times of peacocks. And the questionnaire survey was carried out in 20 randomly selected informants, and also it represented 4 from each sample, and also focused mainly on the identification of causes and impacts of peafowl invasions on to the human activities. So in data analysis, mainly the priority ranking analysis method which we used in Microsoft Excel and SPSS statistics, and also we have used graphs, maps, and charts information presentation. So in talking about the risks, we have mainly identified 5 main habitats, and this is a hand-drawn map which has located the 5 main locations, as well as it has updated the land use pattern as well. So according to our research, we could identify that more than 60% of identified peacock had visited these sites between their productive time from 9 to 12 a.m. And also home gardens are identified as the most popular site, which had nearly 38% of the identified peafowls during the study period. And when comparing the percentages of peacocks identified in school land and playground area with those of paddy lands and home gardens, the cultivation lands including home gardens and paddy lands rank highest. For we identified that the reason for having high concentration of peafowls in cultivated lands is the food security they had, and also the heterogeneity of food sources available in those areas. So when identifying the dynamics in the peafowl concentrations in the area, the people had observed that the number of peafowls in the area had gradually decreased during 5 to 6 years. 5 main reasons were highlighted by the people that have caused the decrease in people in the peafowl individuals in the study area. So those reasons were habitat loss, climate change, killing for flesh and oil, predators, and lack of food with shifting cultivation. So among them, climate change ranked in the highest position. And when talking about the relationship between snake distribution and the peafowl concentration in the area, the peafowls being an omnivorous species of birds, snakes become one of their favorite feasts. But the decrease of peafowls in the area has shown an increase in the snakes as there is no enough peafowl predators to kill the snakes for their food. So there is a significant increase in the snakes when the peafowl population is decreased in the area. So the main reason for this is the reduction of predators for the snakes in the area. And 80% of the informants suggested that snake bites are higher due to the increase of snakes in the area when the peacock population is decreased with climate change and the habitat fragmentation. And when talking about the influence of seasonal changes on arrival of peafowls to the village, so when talking with the villagers, it was suggested that there is a variation in the arrival of peacocks with the seasonal changes and the climatic changes. So nearly 80% of peafowls were coming towards the village area with the onset of rainfall, and also with the start of rainfall, more than 90% of the cultivated lands are being harvested by the farmers, and the arrival of peafowls to the cultivated lands become a huge threat for the farmers during this period. So a rapid flow of peafowls towards the village areas during Maha season, and also 60% of the informants suggested that most of the peafowls who had gone to the jungle due to the lack of food in village areas with scarcity of water in Yala season are coming back to the area in Maha season in search of food and water. So this graph clearly suggests how the influence of rainfall impact on the arrival of peafowls. So when talking about the impacts of peafowl on human activities, we could identify several damages or the impacts caused by peafowls on human activities. They included damaging electricity lines, high disturbing noise, damaging home gardens, damaging the roofs of the houses, and damaging paddy cultivations. So among all these factors, the damages that they cause on paddy cultivations rank in the highest position. And also, when talking about this kind of a study, we can conclude that culling of peacocks is not the solution to control this kind of a issue, because peacocks or these living beings are also a part of the earth and also part of the ecosystem. So culling is not the only solution for this. So the decline of endemic biodiversity at alarming rates, so especially of the endemic snakes, may result in overbreeding of other pests too, like mice and rats, which are controlled by snakes. Therefore, in order to balance the environment equilibrium, in order to have a very good ecosystem, a healthy ecosystem, we need to maintain all these interactions in a healthy manner. So the delay in taking long-term or short-term action will result in severe crop damage and the loss of ecological integrity as well. So both man and animals need to share this earth harmoniously, as this place is made for all living creatures to exist cooperatively. So we should enrich the predator habitats and enforce hunting laws for sustainable conservation. So in this study, we would like to suggest and conclude that culling of peacocks is not the only solution to control this issue. If we would go for some sustainable measures to control naturally by the natural environment, then it would be very much easy to make this earth a very sustainable place for all the living beings to live harmoniously. Thank you.
So, thank you very much. Thank you very much for interesting presentation. I remind you, it dealt with a site-specific study on peacock and human conflict referring to a case study in a region in Sri Lanka. Thank you very much for the presentation. I urge you to use the chat if you have questions, so that the speakers can address these questions. However, before we proceed further, I would like to introduce my co-chair, our colleague Miss Anoya Seneviratne, who I would like to introduce, who can share a few thoughts before we proceed. I forgot to actually, when I introduced myself earlier, I'm not sure everybody was present in the session because I suspect I was disconnected from the work group. I am Professor Ruben Paul Borch. As you know, I come from the University of Malta. I come from the Faculty for the Built Environment. I have been active on various projects, in particular related to this theme on the project dealing with capacity building in Asia for disaster risk reduction. My main research activity is in materials and structural engineering and in sustainable buildings, sustainable development. Now I would like to introduce Ms. Anoya Seneviratne to make her introduction. Thank you, Anoya.
It's a great pleasure to be with you as a co-chair for this Sendai Framework for DRR and the Sustainable Development Goal, which we believe that it is not be a plan for the entire globe. So this should be an action and we need to implement these things. So I am very pleased. I'm working in Disaster Management Center. We are very highly focused on the implementation. So I am very pleased that we are having a very rich presenters, so they will definitely discuss what we have to do and how we have to implement all these things. So with that, I warmly welcome all these the session speakers and hope to have a very great discussions on the Sendai Framework for disaster risk reduction and the sustainable development goals and its coherence. Thank you, sir. It's over to you.
Thank you, Anoya. Basically, before you joined in, I informed the speakers that there will be a question and answer session, and they can use the chat to send their questions. I also would like to inform everybody that at the end of each presentation, actually, there can be some comments, some insights. You can write your questions in the chat, and the speaker will immediately try to address these. So I encourage you to use this chat. We will also have a summary discussion at the end, time permitting. However, Anoya, now that you are with us, you can introduce the next speakers in the coming for the coming sessions, for the coming presentations. I have already introduced the first speaker, so I think we can move on to the second speaker because we don't have any questions in the chat. I suspect we can have some questions at the end probably, but it's up to those present, of course. So Anoya, can I leave it up to you to introduce the next speaker?
Next speaker.
Okay, so the next we have the next speaker is about targets and challenges for India dealing with sustainable development goals and disaster risk reduction. It's by Mishra. So I welcome the next speaker. The presentation is entitled Sustainable Development Goals and Disaster Risk Reduction, Targets and Challenges for India. Thank you very much.
It is indeed a privilege to get this opportunity to make a presentation before such an august gathering of experts and scholars in a conference which is contextually very, very significant, not only for India or the South Asia region, but for the global community at the larger level. My primary presentation essentially is based on how sustainable development goals are becoming more and more significant for India to put in place a disaster risk reduction strategy on the ground to strengthen its resilience to combat disasters. As we know, the United Nations Sustainable Goal number 13, for the first time, delineated a global agenda to combat climate change and disasters. In fact, it puts in place a detailed disaster risk reduction vision for the global community. India, being a signatory, of course, is bound by the commitments it has made, and it needs to take urgent steps to achieve these targets. Now, I wish to start my presentation with some important data, some important figures which came out of a global research by United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction and Center for Research on the Epidemiology of Disaster. It said, climate-related disaster events like floods, storms, and heat waves more than doubled from 3,017 events recorded between 1976 and 1995 to 6,392 events recorded during a 20-year period between 1996 and 2015. That essentially means that in last 4 decades, the entire pattern of climate-related disaster incidents has changed, and they have actually doubled in last 2 decades. Now, that takes me to the next important point, which is the fact that India, being a high disaster-prone country, especially to climate-related disasters, has actually lost 97,691 precious lives in natural disasters between 1996 and 2015. The most disturbing for India is the rise in the frequency of flood disasters. Between 1996 and 2005, a total of 13,660 lives were lost in 67 flood incidents in India. But in the subsequent decade, that is from 2006 to 2015, a total of 15,860 people lost their lives in 90 flood incidents. So you can see there's a significant increase from 67 flood incidents to 90 in last 1 decade. And of course, being a highly populous country, one of the largest number of people are actually exposed to disasters every year. This is part of India, of course, is a victim of climate change in terms of the larger changes that have been seen in the global climate. The NASA latest data shows that the 17 of the 18 warmest years in the last 136 years have been recorded after 2001, with the year 2019 being the second warmest year on record. The increase in global temperature since 1880 is 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit. Global temperatures are projected to rise by up to 3.2 degrees Celsius by 2100. That's the one big major challenge that global community needs to fight. Now, NASA's GRACE satellites have also recorded a gradual decline in ice mass in both Antarctica and Greenland. Average increase in global sea level is close to 700 years. And of course, India is not unaffected by this process, as the UN Secretary General himself said when he released a report on the climate economy called the New Climate Economy Report. And I quote him, where he mentioned India. He said, climate change is running faster than we are. We have seen the terrible flooding in Kerala in India. The last 19 years included 18 of the warmest years on record, and the greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere continue to rise. A significant remains between the national commitments and the emission reductions we need. And that is the challenge he has outlined for the global community. Now, going back to the Kerala floods that the UN Secretary General mentioned, of course, was one flood. A first flood incident, I think, in the last 5 years, in which a direct correlation was sought to be linked with climate change that is going on in India. And in fact, the Central Water Commission data showed that there was an overall 164% above normal rainfall in the state in just 19 days, 1st August to 19th August. And that is why state had to undergo a catastrophic disaster incident. I interviewed the then Director General of Indian Meteorological Department, KJ Ramesh, and he said to me on camera, on record, Kerala floods were an outcome of the impact of climate change itself. Country has witnessed the evidence of significant changes in extreme weather events, and the extreme rainfall in Kerala happened because of these changes in India's climate. In terms of rainfall, it was exceptionally high. And he was the first Government of India official to actually directly link Kerala floods with climate change. And now that brings me to the fact that India is very highly vulnerable to climate change. It's not only Kerala. The Global Climate Risk Index 2020 report released by German Watch this year has in fact put India as the 5th most vulnerable country in the world in the global list of countries which are vulnerable to climate change. And the rise of cyclones in India also disturbing, along with floods. In 2017, 3 cyclones were recorded. 2018, it increased to 7. 2019, it further increased to 8. And this is the data that Science and Technology Minister had submitted in Parliament. Now, to combat this, India has a policy framework called National Action Plan on Climate Change, which is the primary document, which is in different stages of implementation. And it says very categorically that at the national level, increase of minus 0.4 degrees Celsius has been observed in surface air temperatures over the past century. That essentially means that this process has been continuing in India gradually for last almost 100 years. To combat this, India's nationally determined contributions actually includes 8 goals that has to be achieved between 2021 and 2030 period. A commitment to reduce the emissions intensity of its GDP by 33 to 35% by 2030 from the 2005 level, and a commitment to reduce the emissions intensity of its GDP by 20 to 25% by 2020. Now, this target, the second target, has been achieved. Environment Minister Prakash Javadekar in a media briefing said on December 12th that India has achieved 21% of its target of reducing emissions intensity of GDP by 33 to 35% by 2030. And he also admitted that India is contributing 6.8% of global emissions, and per capita emissions is 1.9 tons. Now, series of steps have been taken to address it at the policy level. Coal Ministry has made it mandatory for all new coal-based generating stations to use supercritical technology to reduce carbon footprints in the coal industry. Indian steel companies have initiated steps to adopt state-of-the-art clean and green technologies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, emission intensity. Telecom Regulatory Authority of India has set targets to reduce carbon emissions in the telecommunications sector, a target of 40% reduction by the year 2022-23. National Thermal Power Corporation, India's biggest power producer, in fact, has set an ambitious target of sourcing 39 gigawatt, that is 30% of its total target, to be sourced from non-fossil fuel-based resources. Now, the second NDC India has committed to is a 40%, achieving about 40% cumulative electric power installed capacity from non-fossil fuel-based energy resources by 2030. It's a very detailed action plan to promote solar energy, wind energy. Wind energy, of course, India is 5th largest wind producer in the world today. Solar power infrastructure is gradually being increased and augmented. The target is to achieve a capacity of 100 gigawatt by 2022. India has also committed to create an additional carbon sink of 2.5 to 3 billion tons of CO2 equivalent through additional forest and tree cover by 2030. And India is moving in that direction. India's State of the Forest report, in fact, talks about the fact that the total carbon stock estimated in country's forests today is more than 7,000 million tons, and this is expected to help achieve the intended targets in this regard. Now, that brings me to the challenges that now lie ahead. The steps have been initiated, but there are several challenges at the policy level. And as it is being said that underdevelopment, institutional failure, and bad governance actually aggravates the damages disasters cause. And that's why it is imperative for India to urgently take more urgent steps to address this issue. India's Disaster Management Act does not in fact mention climate change, global warming, or sustainable development. It needs to be urgently amended to actually put in place a legislative framework to address and meet and take next steps towards achieving these targets. There's a question of mobilization of funds. Indian government has told Indian Parliament that a total of $2.5 trillion will be required to meet the 2030 targets, but as yet no blueprint has been given on from where the funds is going to come. Now, Environment Minister Prakash Javadekar, in fact, did referred to this when he said on 5 years of Paris Agreement. It was decided that every year the world will set aside $100 billion for developing nations to combat climate change. But now more than $1 trillion pending. Climate technology transfer is not happening. Now, this is the target that was there fixed in the sustainable goal number 13. And India is now reminding the developed countries that it needs to keep up its commitments. Now, increase in frequency of cyclones is an unusual event in India. And of course, the institutional structures are now, they still have certain weaknesses in terms of how well and how timely prediction is possible. Difficult also now, scientists say here, that the movement of the sea surface is becoming more and more abnormal with warming, global warming, and that in turn is making it difficult for met agencies to actually accurately predict the movement of the cyclones and the landfall when it happens. And that actually affects how timely warning can be issued to fishermen who live and do fishing in the coastal areas. Now, Kashmir floods and Chennai floods, these were two disaster incidents which actually exposed the fault lines in India's disaster management strategy. And in both these flood incidents, the question came of how the poor management of India's rivers are actually aggravating the challenge that lies on the ground. Illegal encroachment of riverbeds, structural weaknesses in city drainage systems came up. Real estate mafia had actually constructed unlawful residential colonies on the riverbeds. So when river water started overflowing, the damage caused was huge. Now, India also needs to strengthen its NDRF strength, National Disaster Response Force battalion strength. And the last point I wish to make is the latest report of the United Nations on the implementation of the SDGs, which is very important for India and the world. It says that the year 2019 was the second warmest on record, and the end of the warmest decade, that is 2010 to 2019, brought with it massive wildfires, hurricanes, droughts, floods, and other climate disasters across continents. Global temperatures are on track to rise as much as 3.2 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. To meet the 1.5 degrees Celsius or even the 2 degrees Celsius maximum target called for in the Paris Agreement, greenhouse gas emissions must begin falling by 7.6% each year starting in 2020. Despite a drastic reduction in human activity due to COVID-19 crisis, the resulting 6% drop in emissions projected for 2020 falls short of this target, and emissions are expected to rise as restrictions are lifted. And this is the most important point. Despite the COVID-19 induced lockdowns in different parts of the world, the emission targets that the global community needs to move towards, they are still behind it despite COVID-19 induced lockdowns and the stoppage of industrial activity. And that is where the big challenge that India and the global community faces today of how to further increase their resolve and strength to take new steps, restructure their priorities in the emerging post-COVID-19 world order. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Very interesting indeed.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I know that actually there are no specific chat questions related to our presentation yet, but as I said, maybe it's easier to discuss further on at the end. Probably people are thinking on specific questions related to your presentation. And because of time restrictions, I think it's a good idea also to have a discussion at the end between presenters as well. Unless there are questions people would like to ask. Is there anybody who would like to ask a question now? Okay, so we can go on to the next presentation. So the next presentation is entitled Introducing New Initiatives for Resettlement in Sri Lanka, an analysis of resettlement in the region of Aranayake Kegalle. And the presenter is Mahendra. So I would like to invite the presenter to give the talk. Thank you very much.
Hello everyone, I am Mahendra Jagat from Disaster Management Center. I am going to share with you new initiatives for resettlement in Sri Lanka. I have chosen Aranayaka resettlement process as my case study. Aranayaka resettlement process basic figure shown here. 72 families fully damaged and 285 families were partially damaged and 586 families identified as high risk. Among them, 14 houses were completely washed away by the landslide. There are no any members remain to ask any right. 74 families were not included into this resettlement process. 26 families were totally voluntarily rejected this resettlement process. Yeah, look at this slide. This figure shows here the key factor the land. The land is the key factor of the entrance to the resettlement process. When we check the land, if it is safe, then beneficiary can reconstruct their house on same land. If the land is not safe, then they have to move to another location, resettlement. Or directly affected the landslide by the landslide, then they have to move to another location. Then they can be benefited from NITF or directly from the disaster management ministry. Look at the implementation mode. When we come to the implementation mode, we have been identified three driven: state driven, owner driven, and donor driven. In the state driven, totally house was constructed by the government. In the donor driven mode, house was constructed fully or partially by the owner, and third party or government partially engaged to construct the house. In the donor driven mode, internationally or nationally, donors came, they were engaged to construct the house partially or fully. This is the method implemented in Aranayaka resettlement process. Okay, look at the new initiated. The first one is land approved by the NBRO. The second one is plot plan also approved by the NBRO. Land is the key factor of the resettlement. So in the first step, the approval has been chosen by the NBRO. If not, the safety factor not come from the beginning. So this Aranayaka resettlement process clearly identified the safer factors firstly. So land and plot plan approved by the NBRO. The thirdly, house plan also approved by the NBRO. There are 3 core house plan introduced by the NBRO. These house plan accordingly the site selection, site features, terrains, beneficiaries can be selected. These house plans, donors or individuals come up with their if their plan, they can be adhered their plan also, but that plan also should be approved by the NBR. The next one is post-disaster experience incorporated approval. Aranayaka Rwandeniya Chinese housing construction has shown this post-disaster international experience. Most of donors come from international resettlement with the international resettlement experience. That also incorporated into Aranayaka resettlement process. The other one is basic standard, global standard also adhered. 650 square feet house unit, 2 bedroom, living area, kitchen and water seal toilet. That is the minimum standard incorporated in this resettlement process. Without this minimum standard can't be implemented. That is the global standard adhered to this resettlement process. The other one is beneficiary selection to the site. They have been chosen 5 criteria to select the beneficiary to the site. The first come first serve based lottery drawing system in the beneficiary wish, in the donor wish, prime site for prime groups. Those 5 criteria completely adhered by the beneficiaries, and there were no any obstacle. All the committees, housing committee and the disaster management committee and the other ad hoc committees also discuss these factors, and they adhered these criteria with the with their blessing. Beneficiaries without any obstacle, they adhered these criteria, and then beneficiary selected to the location. After selection the location, they have to select their plot. Then that also undergone in 3 criteria: first come first serve basis, lottery drawing system, prime plots for prime beneficiaries. That also without any obstacle approved completely by the committees and the beneficiaries. These are the new initiatives. This is never happened. This was never happened before 2016. Those are new initiatives in the Aranayaka resettlement process. The size of the plot, that also considerable way they have gone. Most comfortable site 10 perch per each plot. The comfortable site 20 perch per each plot. That means the site is nearest to the town. They have been allocated 10 perch. The site is far from the town, that has been allocated 20 perch per each plot. Those are the criteria they have incorporate into this process. The other one is infrastructure facilities. Without infrastructure facilities, the site was not approved. Mainly community center, kindergarten, religious places, the health clinical centers. Those are the key factors they have been considered. The other one is financial allocation system. Disaster resilient financial system launched August 2016, particularly for this per Aranayaka resettlement purposes. So NITF, National Insurance Trust Fund, 2.5 million maximum given to fully damaged house, and directly from the Ministry of Disaster Management, 1.6 million given for the house and land, 1.2 million given for the house, and 0.4 million given to the land. These three options can be adapted according to beneficiary availability, land, house, and their characteristics to the resettlement process. So this component actually new initiative, that is the this component was the turning point of the Sri Lankan resettlement process. Continuously up to now, these processes are implementing without any obstacle, without any hesitate, because of this was succeed than prior 2016 implementation. The other one is okay, you can see here the how many people has been benefited from those financial schemes. Total 512 families were benefited different of the financial schemes. The next one is legal basement. Before 2016, there were no legal basement, but with the initiatives of the Aranayaka, divisional secretary and beneficiary come up with the agreement. With that agreement, there were 5 installment system. In the 4th installment, the beneficiary agreed to demolish their old house, and 25,000 were retention. Then it was released after they received the final certificate of the NBRO, and deed also given after the issuing that final certificate. The other one is chance to move across the country. 15 families has been gone from Maranayaka to another divisions. The 12 families has been gone to out from the Kegol district. That is also a reinvigoration of the international adherence, international agenda. In Article 9 of the Pinheiro Principle clearly says the right of move anywhere of the displacement, it is a good quality right. The other one is the Universal International Declaration of Human Rights, Article 12 says the right of the move to anywhere or without arbitrary interference of the government, move to anywhere of the displacement is the clear right. This has been reinvigorated by these initiatives of Paranayaka resettlement. The other one is high possibility to adhere the global trend. Global trend is the high vertical flat type, condominium type, two-storied building for the resettlement. That has been incorporated into this Aranayaka resettlement. Aranayaka Ruandeniya Chinese village, one kind of example for that one. The next one is from the beginning to end, close monitoring system also gone. Hard copy has given to each and every beneficiary by the NBRO. Then mobile app also launched for the monitoring purposes. Then you can see here drones camera also used to monitor the site. According to the monitoring system, we can see here how is the progress has been gone. The other one is beyond the new initiatives. Those are the we discussed new initiatives, Aranayaka resettlement. Beyond that, we have to rethink people-centered, balancing provisions and support, incremental actions on the subject, risk-informed and environmentally friendly, settlement and restitution permanently informed, multidimensional and integrated around the centrality of protection, displacement susceptibility. Those factors also we have to rethink for the new resettlement in future of Sri Lankan resettlement process. So these are the identified factors and figures from the Aranayaka resettlement. Thank you very much for your attention. If you have any clarification, please share with me. I can respond for that. Thank you very much.
Second. Okay, thank you for your presentation. Much appreciated. Very interesting presentation. And there's a quick question from one of our colleagues, if I may go onto the question immediately. It states the following. Mahendra, it is interesting topic that you are discussing. I need to know whether you all have done any previous need assessment before the project or any social impact assessment, whether it has been carried out. Can you answer this question?
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. Actually, this was a good initiative. I shown here all the details and the initiatives. Before the project, actually, the social impact assessment has been done. That means all the displacement were in the transitional shelters before move on to the permanent restitution. In the transitional shelters, there were camp managers and other stakeholders who look after the beneficiaries, the displacement. When they look after at that transitional shelters, we given to that impact assessment, that social-based questionnaires and other things to survey their need. According to that, their need, we have chosen the particular site and the beneficiaries and those things. Actually, the answer to the question is, actually, we have done that social impact assessment.
Yeah. Actually, I also would like to add something on that. So while doing this resettlement program, social impact assessment and the economic viability and the community participation also ensured. So this is quite an interesting topic because countries like Sri Lanka, we are having these resettlement issues, particularly on this disaster management things. So with that, I would like to introduce our next speaker. She's Chamindi Malalgoda. She will discuss on the built environment disciplines roles in disaster risk reduction. So Chamindi, the floor is yours.
Hello everyone, I'm Chamindi Malalgoda. I'm a senior lecturer and also I'm a member of the Global Disaster Resilience Centre of the University of Huddersfield, UK. My today's presentation is about the built environment discipline's role in disaster risk reduction. This is the outline of my today's presentation. First, I'm going to talk about the introduction to this research, and then we will move on to my research aim and the methodology. Then we will take a look at the key findings of this research, and finally, the conclusions. As we all know, disasters cause a significant amount of damage and losses around the world every year. And there has been an increase in the number of natural disasters over the past few years, and the impact in terms of human, structural, and economic losses has increased considerably. When we look at the damage, disaster damage, the damage to the built environment accounts for most of the economic losses of disasters, and its failure often determines the amount of fatalities, where collapsing of buildings and infrastructure pose one of the main threats. Therefore, it is very important that we develop this built environment with an effective degree of resilience so that it can adapt and withstand to the threats posed by natural and human-induced disasters. In doing so, the construction industry and the built environment professionals has to play a key role, and therefore the construction industry and the built environment disciplines are expected to play a predominant role in reducing disaster risk and recovery from natural and human-induced disasters. Within this context, the aim of my research is to understand the role of the built environment disciplines in attainment of the Sendai Framework for disaster risk reduction. So when we look at my research aim, it has two key phrases. The first one is the built environment disciplines, and then the Sendai Framework for disaster risk reduction. So before we move on to my methodology, let's very quickly look at what I meant by the built environment disciplines and what the Sendai Framework for disaster risk reduction is all about. Built environment disciplines. In my research, I have broadly categorized the built environment disciplines into four broader professions, namely the architects, engineers, surveyors, and planners. And moving on to the Sendai Framework for disaster risk reduction. It is one of the post-2015 global frameworks, and it was endorsed by the UN General Assembly following the 2015 third UN World Conference on Disaster Risk Reduction. The Sendai Framework for disaster risk reduction aims to guide the multi-hazard management of disaster risk in development at all levels, as well as within and across all sectors. So if we look at the Sendai Framework for disaster risk reduction, it is built around four priorities. The four priorities are, the first one is understanding disaster risk, and then it's about strengthening disaster risk governance to manage disaster risk. Then it's about investing in disaster risk reduction for resilience. And finally, the final priority is enhancing disaster preparedness for effective response and to build back better in recovery, rehabilitation, and reconstruction. Let's move on to my research methodology. This research was done as part of a broader project, which was called CADRI. CADRI stands for Collaborative Action for Disaster Resilience Education. And this project was aimed at developing a professional doctorate for disaster resilience education. So as part of this broader research, we have conducted 87 semi-structured interviews with 5 stakeholder groups. You can see the stakeholder groups here, the national and local government, higher education and research, private sector, community, and NGOs and the INGOs. Altogether, 87 semi-structured interviews were conducted. And then all these interviews were recorded, voice recorded, transcribed and thematically coded with respect to 4 priorities defined in the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction. In addition, a comprehensive literature review was carried out to reinforce the findings of the primary data analysis. And then we did a desk review of Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction to map the roles of the built environment disciplines identified through this primary and secondary data analysis with the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction. Okay, now let's move on to my key findings. As mentioned before, these findings were presented in relation to the 4 priority areas identified in the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction. So we will start with the priority 1. The first priority is understanding disaster risk. So under the first priority, we were able to come up with 10 key roles for built environment disciplines. So here in this table, you can see the roles that we have identified under the priority 1. So some of the roles that we have identified are disaster risk assessment, land surveying, GIS mapping of disaster impact and risk, building quality audits, advice on new and revised building codes, building and planning regulations, advice on urban planning and land use, advice on capacity and adequacy of critical infrastructure, strength and retrofit vulnerable infrastructure, and so on. So those are some of the roles that we have identified under priority 1. So here in this column, you can see the responsible built environment discipline to carry out these the roles. And also here you can see in the last column, you can see the reference to the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction. And we were able to map all these roles with the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction. Moving on to the priority 2. The priority 2 is about strengthening disaster risk governance to manage disaster risk. So here in this column, you can see the roles that we have identified under priority 2. We have identified 8 roles under the priority 2. The first one is aid in local government and land administration and cadastral mapping, advice on land and property legislation, advice on regulatory frameworks and ways they could be improved, and so on. So here you can find in the next column, you can see the disciplines involved, and also you can see the reference to the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction. We were able to map all these roles with the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction. Moving on to the third priority. The third priority is about investing in disaster risk reduction for resilience. So under the third priority, we were able to come up with 7 key roles for the built environment disciplines. The first one is advice on disaster risk transfer and insurance, advice on innovative financial mechanisms, monitoring funding, and so on. So these are the disciplines that that are responsible for carrying out these roles. And then you can see the reference to the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction in the final column. We were able to map most of these roles with the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, except for the 5th one, which is about conducting investment appraisals for cost-benefit analysis. So except for that, we were able to map all other roles with the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction. Moving on to the final priority, which is about enhancing disaster preparedness for effective response and to build better in recovery and rehabilitation and reconstruction. On the final priority, we were able to come up with 18 key roles. You can see the key roles that we have identified here in this table, starting with aid in logistical planning, damage assessment, assessment of compensation claims and insurance, identify, survey and procure safe lands, procure and supply of emergency shelters, and so on. And here you can see the disciplines, the responsible disciplines, and the reference to the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction. again, we were able to map most of these roles with the Sendai Framework for disaster risk reduction, except for the 16th one, which is about advice on land boundary issues, providing support on land rights and claims. Finally, the conclusions. The built environment disciplines, if we look at the Sendai Framework for disaster risk reduction, the built environment disciplines were not specifically referenced in the Sendai Framework for disaster risk reduction. However, it highlights the importance of engaging multiple stakeholders in disaster risk reduction. It also provides reference to most of the identified roles within the study, except for few roles such as investment appraisals and the cost-benefit analysis, and also advice on land boundary issues and providing support on land rights and claims. So that's the end of my presentation. So if you have any questions, please let me know. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chamindi, for your very comprehensive presentation on very interesting topic on this built environment disciplines. So it seems that in the chat box, there's no any questions. So with the time constraint and all these the things, we will discuss if there's any question in later. So now, with your permission, I would like to move to the next presentation. It is on the assessing the effectiveness of relief allocation for the drought affected area. The study is based on the remote sensing images. So the presenter is Mr. Ruchira Ekanayaka from Disaster Management Center. Ruchira, it's over to you.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone who is joining for this virtual symposium from all around the world. I am Ruchira Ekanayaka, currently working as a remote sensing and GIS analyst for the Disaster Management Center. In this case study, I am going to demonstrate the feasibility of utilizing Earth observation data for monitoring post-disaster relief allocation. In order to keep the study context limited, I have only considered drought as a disaster. Furthermore, the main reason I have chosen study area as Anuradhapura, since it is among the most affected districts in Sri Lanka due to long seasons of drought. We all know drought is one of the major hazards related to water in the world. Since Sri Lanka is specially located close to the equator, it is frequently affected by warm climatic conditions. This can be frequently observed by frequent occurrences of drought in the country. When considering the annual statistics from 1976 to 2019, there had been 4 years stand out from the rest of the periods. In 1988, around 1.6 million people were affected due to drought. In 2001, which was the longest drought season of the period, it was recorded more than 3 million affected people. Also, in both 2004 and 2017, more than 2.6 million people had been affected due to long drought season. So by looking at this statistic, we can clearly see an alarming trend of increasing drought in Sri Lanka. When considering the spatial distribution of drought since 1974, Anuradhapura, Puttalam, Kurunegala, Monragala and Hambantota are among the most vulnerable districts affected by drought. Moving on to the affected crop yield, which illustrates in the right image, Kurunegala district is by far the most affected among other districts. However, districts such as Anuradhapura, Polonnaruwa, Batticaloa indicate a higher degree of affected crop yield also. So we know that drought is widely recognized as a slow creeping natural hazard that occurs due to the natural climatic. According to World Meteorological Organization, since 1967, drought has been directly responsible for tens of thousands of deaths and indirectly responsible for many millions more. Furthermore, drought had costed hundreds of billions of dollars in the worst dry spell of the century in Africa 1991-1992, covering a region of 6.7 million square kilometers and affecting about 24 million people. Therefore, the main problem is that without properly monitoring the drought, it is quite difficult to implement proper drought mitigation strategies that will lead to more impactful investments and achievements. Therefore, the most important thing is that identify which areas are affected due to drought. In this case study, my main objective was to check the applicability of a vegetation-based drought indicator for monitoring long-term drought conditions. In addition to that, my first specific objective was to identify more frequent drought risk zones in Anuradhapura district. After that, I have evaluated whether there is a significant spatial and temporal correlation between post-disaster relief allocation and severity of the drought. Finally, I have identified some of the strategies and practices that should be implemented in institutional level to build up a more resilient community against drought. As I mentioned before, I have chosen Anuradhapura district for the study area because in terms of affected people, Anuradhapura is ranked fourth among other districts behind Kurunegala, Puttalam, and Hambantota. Furthermore, based on the statistics from 1974, more than 25,000 hectares of crops have been completely destroyed due to drought. For the analysis, I have selected Modi's vegetation indices, which were produced on 16-day intervals at 250-meter resolutions, since it provides consistent spatial and temporal comparison of vegetation canopy greenness, chlorophyll, and also canopy structure. Even though there are two vegetation stress indicators, which are NDVI and EVI, which stands for Enhanced Vegetation Index, I have chose EVI since it is known to minimize canopy soil variation and improve sensitivity over dense vegetation conditions when compared to NDVI. Then I have downloaded both EVI product and corresponding pixel reliability file for all the images from 2001 to 2019. Later, I have calculated VCI, which stands for Vegetation Conditional Index, for all the images and masked out all the pixels that consist of cloud cover based on the pixel reliability data. Next, all the images that consist of severe cloud cover were left out of this analysis since it could create an erroneous result on the analysis. In order to get an overall indication of the vegetation stress of each DS division, I have calculated mean VCI for each DS division. Later, mean values of each DS divisions were classified according to the above levels. Finally, the VCI values were compared with post-disaster relief data available in the Disaster Management Center. So moving on to the results and discussion section, this bar graph explicates the number of occurrences that VCI reached over the drought limit. For this, I have considered all the DS divisions which has a VCI value less than 40%. Due to the immense cloud cover, only 25 images were analyzed. Based on the results, it is indicated that Madavachia and Rabava recorded highest VCI occurrences over the drought limit. In this graph, I have represented the frequency of the least VCI occurrences recorded in each DS divisions. Basically, very low VCI occurrence reflect that the considering area is subjected to frequent high vegetation stress, which is a clear indication of constant droughts. Finally, based on the above facts, it is evident that out of all DS divisions of Anuradhapura districts, Kahatagasdigiliya, Rambava, Galembidinuva, and Tirappane indicate extreme vegetation stress. In this slide, I have illustrated the number of people affected in each DS division of Anuradhapura district since the year 2000. Based on the above facts, DS divisions such as Rambava, Nochiyagama, Madavachia, and Galembidinuva are affected the most due to drought. However, when comparing VCI results with the disinventory statistics, which include post-disaster relief allocation results, it is quite difficult to identify a solid, consistent correlation. So, to sum up the findings, it is indicated that Kahatagasdigiliya, Rambava, Galembidinuva, and Tirappane DS divisions are much more likely to affected by long-term agricultural droughts. As I mentioned before, the analysis results do not really indicate a solid consistency between VCI value and disinventory statistics. The main reason could be disinventory statistic does not only indicate affected people due to drought, but also the people affected due to drinking water scarcity, which is a result of short-term meteorological drought due to reduced precipitation and increased evaporation. However, overall research findings indicate that VCI index is much more suitable to assess the impact of agricultural drought towards vegetation. Finally, it is evident that certain parts of Anuradhapura district frequently affected by agricultural drought. Therefore, it is necessary to enforce strategies for drought mitigation in those areas. So when considering the recommendations and future approaches, even though EVI normally provide a comprehensive approach to assess the impact of meteorological drought on vegetation, as an approach in the future, it is much effective to integrate multiple drought indices such as precipitation and soil moisture-based anomalies to analyze all types of drought in critical regions of Sri Lanka. Furthermore, after identifying drought-prone areas, stakeholders should promote shifting to drought-resilient crops and enhance irrigation schemes where it is feasible in those highly drought-prone areas. Secondly, the decision makers should also focus wetland rehabilitation by increasing water holding capacity of soils through tree planting. On the other hand, developing new sources such as microdams, ponds, and wells will certainly help to mitigate risk of drought in affected areas in the future. Finally, in institutional level, relevant authorities should focus on preparing contingency plans, programs, as well as hydraulic infrastructures such as wells, aqueducts, dams, water and sanitary systems to minimize the impact of drought towards general public. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ruchira, for your very comprehensive presentation, very much related to understanding the risk. I think there's one question. So it is, I'll read the questions. So it is basically, so it is basically on the artificial intelligence framework and all. So he's a query that what could be the next generation disaster data infrastructure for DRR? Can you suggest anything with the artificial intelligence framework? So it is a question for everybody, actually, not for the Ruchira. So we will discuss that question later, I think. So we will move to the next presentation. It is on the Sendai Target E, that is the strategy followed for the establishment to the local DRR strategies The presenter will be Mr. R.P. Samarakodi from Disaster Management Center. Over to you, sir.
Strategy framework for the establishment of local disaster risk reduction plans in Sri Lanka. This program was supported by JICA, headed by Takayuki Nagaisan, JICA expert in disaster. We all are here under the target E of the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction 2015-2030. Every country is supposed to have their own national and local disaster risk reduction plans by 2020, according to the guidelines, according to the Sendai Framework. But we all are aware that scope, expected outcomes, and goals are well defined in this framework. The foundation of this framework is guiding principles. That is 13 guiding principles. But complying that 13 guiding principles, that priorities for actions to be addressed at local, national, regional, and global to meet 7 global targets. Understanding this, JICA developed 8 steps as practical methods for developing local DRR strategies. Under this, local governments are expected to develop local DRR strategies together with national government in line with global and national legal frameworks. If you consider the roles of national and local government as public institutions for the execution of this, the national governments are primarily responsible to maintain legal and institutional framework and take necessary action such as budget allocations for the implementing of local DRR plans. In addition, to coordinate among related organizations and establish an implementation structure to support local governments. The local governments are responsible to reduce local disaster risk for the people of their area of jurisdiction. This includes identification of risk, planning, designing, budget allocations, implementation, operation maintenance, monitoring and evaluation of those measures. The local governments are to provide instructions and directions to their community and stakeholders to liaise with self-defense measures for the community, which include compliance of their bylaws, building codes, business continuity plans, and also identify what they can do on their own to reduce the risks. So under this study that we have identified rain-induced disasters, mainly flood and landslides as target disasters. Then Kalu River Basin was identified, Sabaragamuwa Province, Ratnapura District, and Western Province, Kalutara District also identified for this study. That within these districts, 4 local authorities identified: Ayagama, Nivitigala in Ratnapura District, Bulat Sinhala and Kalutara in Kalutara District. That when it comes to that Ayagama and Bulat Sinhala, they are district divisional secretaries areas and Ratnapura and the Pradesh Sabha areas, that the geographical area is the same. But when it comes to the Nivitigala Pradesh Sabha, Nivitigala Pradesh comprise Nivitigala Divisional Secretariat as well as Alapatha Divisional Secretariat. Then that the other way, that Kalutara, if you consider that Kalutara Divisional Secretariat comprise the Kalutara Urban Council as well as Kalutara Pradeshiya Sabha areas. So then the whole program actually was affected due to two reasons. One was actually that everyone knows that Easter attack in April 2019. The second one, since we were under the Ministry of Home Affairs, that we were asked to concentrate divisional secretaries as for the preparation of local DRR plans instead of local authorities. But the problem that actually against that the local DRR protocols. Say suppose if we develop the local DRR plan for the Nimitigala Divisional Secretary area, that then means that it's a part of the Nimitigala Pradeshiya Sabha area. So that is the implementation is difficult. If you take Kalutara Divisional Secretary area, if you develop a plan, then that Kalutara UC and Pradeshiya Sabha, they have only one plan to execute. So with that, we had to concentrate only on Bulat Sinhala and Ayagama due to time constraints for the first phase of the. So when it comes to the administration structure of Sri Lanka, we have executive president, then the central government, cabinet, and then provincial council, local authorities votes as local governance, and districts, divisions, Gram Niladaris, that is actually subnational. They are responsible for the national institution, the national government to serve the 22 million. So to start this program, we had an international program organized on 26 February 2019 at Goldface Hotel. About 140 odd participants participated, including our minister, Ministry of Home Affairs and Provincial Council, HED Ambassador, Japan, and team from JICA, including Takai-san, who helped to draft Sendai Framework in 2005. So that in addition, senior officials, including our secretary, the senior officials from provincial councils, divisional secretaries, district secretaries, divisional secretaries, local authorities were also attending. So in addition, we had a series of meetings at ministry level, provincial level, district level, local authority. Why? That to understand the governance mechanisms, because though that we have fairly nicely drafted constitution along with policies, acts, statutes, that the ground level implementation is different from that of expected. Then we explored the possibilities of using existing practices, complying legal frameworks and individual mandates to implement that local DRR 8-step guide. So with that we drafted 2 DRR plans for flood and landslide for Bulat Sinhala and Ayagama Pradeshiya Sabha areas, as well as guideline with template for drafting local DRR plans for local authority level with a special volume for workshop organizers. Then that is not the end, but actually that there are to be certain things to be continued, but these local DRR plans that we have to discuss with respective district secretaries, provincial councils to obtain their consent for the execution, and then same thing can be continued for the Nimitigala and Kalutara Pradeshiya Urban Council. Then with that knowledge, we can again see whether that if there is anything to be added to the draft that guideline for drafting DRR plans that can be incorporated. At the same time, this thing can be then implemented for other the hazards as well as other local authorities areas. And for this, we can mobilize district disaster management units of DMC. But in parallel, a similar study to be carried out for the strengthening of provincial councils to support their own local authorities. But when it comes, since we have 9 provincial councils, we have to have an oversight committee to be established with the blessings of National Disaster Management Council for the monitoring and periodic reviews. Accordingly, the draft strategy for local DRR can be established for the first. Thank you.
So thank you very much, sir, for your insightful presentation. So with all these things, we have completed 6 presentations, very insightful, comprehensive presentations for the Sendai Framework and the Sustainable Development Goals. So now I think it's time for the question and answer session. So I would like to invite my co-chair, Professor Ruben Paul, to continue the session. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. I would first like to thank all presenters for very, very interesting presentations. As happens in all conferences, we are always somewhat pressed with time. And definitely there is so much more each one of you have to talk about. It's so evident. Well done for this research you presented. It's only with regret that we are always pressed with time and we have to move on to the following session. There were various interesting points which were brought up today in these 6 presentations. In particular, I would like to start off with, we can look at one question which was made to the 5th presentation in particular. It talks about the next generation, disaster data infrastructure. And the question by our colleague is regarding what options are there for us to exploit. Is it only relying on artificial intelligence or are there other possibilities? So maybe we can start off this brief discussion by focusing on this question first, addressed to our colleague, presentation number 5, dealing with the drought-affected areas and the effectiveness of relief action.
Thank you very much. I think that's an interesting question actually. So we all know that currently, like the next step of disaster risk reduction and the technologies is like artificial intelligence. And however, I think in the future, what could be the some trend is that the integrated approach, like a multi-agency collaboration approach by combination of the like volunteer GIS, such as crowdsourcing approach, as well as also, and I think the part of that integrated approach could be artificial intelligence as well. So by going further, as you know, that the newest trends is like blockchain technologies, but currently this blockchain technologies is only famous for like cryptocurrencies, but currency geospatial, in the geospatial ecosystem, people are evaluating how we can utilize these blockchain technologies into geospatial ecosystem as well. I think that's finally what I want to say is that after the artificial intelligence, I think there could be something integrated with these new technologies like blockchain, crowdsourcing data, and also multi-agency collaboration approach.
Thank you. Anybody would like to add something to this important point? Okay, there is another question. It's directed to Mr. Samarkodi. It refers to the importance of implementing the 8 steps in all areas in Sri Lanka, and barriers which can be experienced in this implementation stage. Do you have any comments you would like to make?
Actually speaking, we did a very preliminary study to establish this 8 steps for the establishment of local DRR plans, because even at present, the majority of our work that we are doing without getting much much assistance from local governance. So therefore, this is a new area to when it comes to the Sri Lankan administration structure. This is actually this is a lacking area, because in the local governance and national, subnational, there is the relationship to address to DRR is very minimum. So therefore, that 8 step is the, I think, key thing that we have to concentrate in future to address this. But this is not easy. This is not easy, because I think even we know that provincial councils, local government, that we have to have another similar study to strengthen these provincial councils. Then only that we can trickle down this mechanism to local level for the execution. But I think that we should do, otherwise that otherwise by 2030 we will not be able to reach the targets that we are planning to address DRR. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I note another question to Mr. Himanshu. How to overcome the challenges? What suggestions would you make? So
yes,
yeah,
a very important question. I think the most critical question that now global community faces is that in the emerging post-COVID-19 world, of course, the challenges, the goalposts have become more complicated. If you just take the case of India, the revenue loss, I mean, I'm talking about the financial resources that were always needed to take aggressive steps towards attaining these goals. Now, in the month of April, when the lockdown was imposed, the revenue shortfall, the GST revenue shortfall in India, just to give you one instance, was 28,000 crore was the total GST collection in April 2020, whereas in April 2019, the total GST collection, the gross, the GST collection was 110,000 crores. So there was a 82,000 crore, which in dollar terms would be around $11.5 billion. That's the revenue loss that Indian state had to incur just in 1 month in April because of the lockdown. So I think the COVID-19 pandemic has severely debilitated the ability of the states to generate the kind of financial resources that are needed to actually attain these goals. Now, second question is that the global community has always been behind the targets. I've made a very detailed presentation on that. In fact, the carbon emissions that needed to be reduced per year is the annual target set at the Paris Climate Conference was 7.6% annual, whereas despite the COVID-19 induced restrictions on economic activity when the factories were closed in many parts of the world, the total expected reduction in carbon emissions intensity is expected to be around 6%. So during the worst pandemic in last 100 years, the worst and the most severest lockdown, imposition of lockdown, still the carbon emissions intensity reduction is expected only 6%. That shows that at the level of policy, at the level of financial resource generation, at the level of how far the countries actually will keep their commitments. Now, we know the American presidential elections have just gone over. A new president is taking over next month. And we expect the developed countries to keep up the commitments. Environment Minister of India actually made a very important briefing 3 days back, where he said that India has already met 21% reduction in the carbon emissions intensity targets that it had set for itself at the Paris Climate Conference. But he also said that the commitment that the developed countries had to make, $100 billion investment to help developing countries meet the Paris climate targets, that is not happening, and a lot of funds are still pending that the developed countries have to contribute. So there are questions about financial resources. There are questions about the commitments that countries have made. There are questions about how many countries are lagging behind the nationally determined contributions, the NDCs that they have made at the Paris Climate Conference. And of course, the most important thing, I think, as a journalist, I can tell you that we have covered one of the unprecedented reverse migration in India, and hundreds of millions of people have become more and more food insecure. In fact, number of people who have now fallen below poverty line, not only in India, but at the global level, the number of people who have become food insecure, and there are global data that has been released by World Bank, World Food Organization. All these suggest that world has been pushed behind from the fixed targets, the intended targets that SDGs had set. And that's the big challenge. Fighting poverty has become more difficult. Fighting food insecurity has become more difficult. Fighting and helping people come out of hunger has become more difficult. Amassing financial resources, whether the developed countries or the developing countries or the poor countries, they're all now struggling. The growth rates, of course, in the first quarter had fallen to 23.9% in India. So the contraction, the economic contraction, the economic recession, unprecedented in last 100 years, all these will actually create a situation where in the post-COVID-19 world, the entire global community actually has to reorient, restructure their priorities if these SDG targets have to be met. And especially considering the recent rise in disasters, it's becoming more and more imperative that challenges that climate change poses is rising. The ability of the states to fight those challenges at the policy level, at the financial level, is becoming rather weak. And that is the big challenge that global community faces today. You have to act actually at several levels to actually fight this great challenge that COVID-19 pandemic has put before us. And I think the nations will have to decide where they spend money. They have been spending money in the last 50 years. The entire restructuring of financial priorities, resource generation, creation of jobs, hundreds of millions of people have become jobless in the world. So many targets of SDGs have been affected because of COVID-19 pandemic. And that's the big challenge that the global community will have to come back, sit together, brainstorm again on how to reorient and restructure their priorities. So I hope this answers the...
Yeah. Thank you very much. Very, very interesting insights. Post-COVID is offers also opportunities, but it's indeed a challenging period for all regions in the world. In that we need to cope with new realities, which will impact us. So very, very interesting observations. I have a question. There is a, sorry.
Shall I add something?
Yes, sure, sure. Yes, please.
Yeah. So that to perform that is sustainable development goals and Paris Agreement, I think that the platform is the Sendai Framework. Actually, that addressing risk is the primary. Therefore, what I feel that we have to have some sort of uniformity to address this, but the platform is to address, we have to make use of this platform to address SDGs and Paris Agreement. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. I note a question which is regarding the CIDRE program to Chaminda. The question is about the program implementation, how it's getting on and how it can be sustained.
Hi, the CADRI project, CADRI actually stands for Collaborative Action Towards Disaster Resilience Education. That project has now been ended. So the final report has been published and the project has been concluded. The presentation that I made today is kind of a byproduct of this project. The overall project, the aim of the project was to develop a professional doctorate in disaster resilience education. So the framework has been developed now and the participating institutions are now trying to integrate it into their academic programs. So that's where we are at the moment in relation to the CADRI program. But the findings, of course, we have disseminated the findings via various stakeholder workshops in the participating countries.
Thank you very much. So I think I have a final question. Just excuse me. Okay. Okay. Reporting on the session. So a final question. So there is a comment from Himanshu with an answer which it's worth sharing here. I think COVID-19 pandemic has further complicated the challenges that lie ahead towards attaining SDGs. The limited ability of the states to cobble. Okay, this is something which was mentioned a few minutes ago, indeed, by our colleague Himanshu. Definitely very, very valid points, and the economic recession is affecting the way we see the world around us and our existing frameworks and the goals. I have a final question to the first presentation, because so far we have discussed all presentations except the first. Actually, I have a very quick question to the first presenter. About the human conflict and the site-specific study on peacocks. And from the point, I mean, a very interesting approach. How can this study be extrapolated to other regions? How easy it is to extrapolate the study? How effective it is? Which are the opportunities to extract the framework of such a study to other regions?
Yes, sir. This kind of a study, although I have mainly focused on the Sri Lankan context, this wildlife-human conflict is something which is available mostly in the Asian region, where the agricultural activities play a vital role in their livelihoods. So in a country like Sri Lanka, this becomes one of the worst problems that people need to find solutions with the help of the authority as well. So I think this kind of a study would become kind of an eye-opener for the other regional, the other countries in the region as well, because we need to find solutions in a sustainable way without harming the environment, as also we have to find solutions in such a way it helps all the communities, including the animals, plants, as well as the human. So in most of these kind of studies, and also when I was going through the literature, I could find that the human encroachment and the human invasion to the habitats of these wildlife has become the main cause for this kind of conflicts. For example, in Sri Lanka, if we take this human-elephant conflict, the main reason is the people have invaded their lands and they have started all agricultural activities in those areas. So the main reason for that is the human activity. So I think I saw one question there, what the wildlife authorities can do to for this kind of a question. So I would like to say that the people should be, the wildlife authorities or the other authorities should make the people aware about their limitations as well as, because if we can protect or if we can maintain our limits in the environment, then it would affect the entire community to live peacefully. So I think this kind of a study would kind of an eye-opener for the entire world as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. With those comments, I think we've come Okay. Okay, there is a final comment. In fact, I would like to invite Anoya, my co-chair, to comment on this because it's addressed to her in concluding the session. And the question is regarding the work by DMC and what is needed and what is being planned. Anoya, would you like to address this as a final
yes,
concluding comment?
Yeah. Yes, thank you, sir. Thank you very much. So we have completed already the very comprehensive 6 presentations. So Disaster Management Center as the one apex body in Sri Lanka for the disaster risk reduction. We are very collaboratively work with other agencies, stakeholder agencies. So I will start very briefly what we are going to do for the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction and the Sustainable Development Goal initially. So Disaster Management Center is the focal point for the implementation of the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction with the support of the national platform for the DRR, which include the government, private sector, and the semi-government sector, as well as the NGO, INGO, UN agencies. So we are having a very broad platform. Using this platform, we are implementing the disaster risk reduction activities. We have collaboratively implement a lot of activities. So, I mean, time will not allow me to explain all these things. So anyhow, for the sustainable development goals, as we all know that, I mean, all these indicators in the Sendai framework, as well as the sustainable development goals, there are a lot of coherence. So using all these coherence, we have developed some systems to report the Sendai framework as well as the sustainable development goals in a one particular system. So for that, we have collaboratively working with the Census and Statistics Department of the Government of Sri Lanka, and we are working with the National Planning Department to incorporate disaster risk reduction things. So basically, if I mean really understood this, the 4 priorities of the Sendai framework, what we have to do is that we have to mainstream disaster risk reduction into the development. So everybody is interested in development. Sustainable development goal also consider the sustainable development. So to achieve the resilience, what we need to do is that we have to incorporate risk reduction measures into this development. So they are very collaboratively we are working. So particularly on these wildlife issues. So I mean for the elephant conflict issues and some peacock issues and all these issues. So we had a very broad discussions with the wildlife organizations also in Sri Lanka. So they are actually, we are planning to implement the wildlife, I mean, to collaboratively work with the wildlife department to minimize the impact of these things. So those discussions going on. So now we are in the process of preparation of the national strategies for the disaster risk reduction in the country. Now we are in the final stage. So in this report, in these strategies also, we are very comprehensively address all these issues. So with that, I would like to congratulate all the researchers and the presenters here and the participants on behalf of Disaster Management Center as a co-organizer on this. So I would like to thank them and appreciate your contribution. So, sir, Professor Ruben, so thank you very much for your guidance and cooperation for this. And it is over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, Anoya. It was indeed a pleasure meeting you all today. Indeed, very interesting listening to the presentations, your activities in the region. Actually, it's so insightful to listen to you. And I'm also so glad to have had the opportunity to have all 6 presentations being discussed at the end. I would like to sincerely thank Anoya for supporting this discussion and very nicely concluding the session explaining these key issues. There is a note from our coordinators thanking all the presenters for the inputs in the conference. Thank you for the discussion and thanking the co-chairs for the session. Thank you to Shara. I will be, together with Anoya, sending you the report for this session. In the meantime, I wish you good continuation of the conference. Well done to the organizers, well done to the all participants and presenters, and sending best regards to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you
very much for this.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ruben, sir. Thank you, Anuja, ma'am.
Thank you.
Thank you.